Hello everyone, this is NPC's Economics.
Disinflation, we think, is here to stay, and as an example of that, I was really encouraged to see overnight the New York Fed.
Disinflation has definitely reappeared in 2023, as headline inflation has declined.
After months of mainstream media cheerleading, the key gauge of inflation rose more than expected in February 2024, as gasoline prices and shelter costs increased. The overall consumer price index ticked up 0.4%, up from 0.3% in January, month over month. The headline CPI is up 3.2% from a year ago, marking an uptick from January's year-over-year reading of 3.1%. Furthermore, the core rate is up 3.8% from a year ago, down from January's 3.9%. The personal consumption expenditure is the Federal Reserve's preferred measurement of inflation. Although the year-over-year change of the PCE is coming down, it is still above pre-pandemic trends, which likewise indicates the stickiness of inflation. The so-called last-mile fight to rein in inflation is often difficult. Rate hikes take several months, if not years, to fully take effect. And the Federal Reserve has said that it won't move rates at the March meeting. But despite Papa J. Powell's best efforts, inflation could come roaring back. But first, let's look at some history. The time is late 1940s, a couple of years after the end of World War II. World War II was an extraordinary external catalyst that forced the US government to respond with massive fiscal deficit spending. Just like how the Mexican beer virus prompted Congress to respond with massive fiscal deficit spending. At that time, federal budget deficits were so large that an unprecedented huge amounts of treasuries were issued to pay for it, which in turn forced the Fed to create a lot of new based money to keep yields low. As a result, total demand along with money supply rose faster than supply could keep up with, causing a huge spike in fiscal-driven inflation. During the whole period, interest rates were held extremely low. But despite that, the US entered into a recession in November 1948, and then inflation started to come down, with even a brief period of deflation. Consumers saw reprieve in price levels, but little did they know that inflation came roaring back in the early 1950s. Today, the Federal Reserve is certainly trying to avoid that same thing from happening, hence the soft landing narrative. And that's why it has been holding the Fed funds rate steady for over 7 months and counting. But many have gone drunk on a decade plus of cheap money and are calling for rate cuts, even though the current rate is comparable to historical average levels. But what happens when the central bank and the White House butt heads with each other? Ever since Papa J. Powell started raising the Fed funds rate in March 2022, there have been opposing forces of loose fiscal policy and tight monetary policy playing out in the US economy. While J. Powell and gang are trying to rein in inflation, Congress, which has gotten addicted to cheap money and spending like a drunk sailor, has continued to deficit spend with no end in sight. The ongoing loose fiscal policy, that is, the deficit spending by the government, began to balance out the tight monetary policy by the Fed. This results in a tug-of-war of some sort, although it seems that the fiscal side is winning. And historically, the fiscal side almost always wins. But in a rising interest rate environment, government expenditure on loan interest payments also climb. What this means is that when hits the fan, the US government will turn on the printer and go brrr. Inflate the debt away. In just 3 years, The amount spent servicing its debt every year climbed $426 billion from 2020 to 2023. In 2022, interest payments exceeded federal spending on the military-industrial complex, which itself is a large chunk of its discretionary budget. And at the current trajectory, interest payment might surpass Social Security payments eventually. But no politician will pass legislation to structurally change Social Security in any significant way, regardless of the debt level, since that's political career suicide. Clearly, this is not sustainable. Eventually, the US government will need to somehow consult Dave Ramsey or Caleb Hammer to get its spiraling debt under control. In the meantime, debt levels continue to climb, and the US government could eventually reach a stage where debt levels get so large relative to the size of the economy that it becomes impossible to deleverage them nominally without crashing the economy. Instead, the central bank would have to increase the monetary base and inflate the debt away. The alternative to that is a deflationary economic collapse, but an utterly unpopular choice that no policymaker would ever take. Ultimately, the Fed is backed into a corner and have no other choice, so inflation it is. The US government borrows money through the US Treasury auctions by issuing securities. But have you wondered what would happen if there are not enough lenders? That if a US Treasury auction fails? When an auction fails, that means there are not enough lenders, individual lenders and institutional lenders, lined up to lend the US Treasury money. This implies a lack of confidence by people in the Treasury's ability to pay back its debt. Enter the reverse repo facility. In a reverse repurchase agreement, a buyer purchases securities from a counterparty with the agreement to sell them back at a higher price at a later date. The reverse repo facility represents how much excessive cash in the financial system there is. But right now, more cash is being sucked out of the reverse repo facility, and it is a matter of time before it is drained. And once it's drained, the government cannot borrow from it. This doesn't mean, however, that the US government will default. When that happens, it will turn to the Treasury general accounts to cover the shortfall. Remember when people freaked out last June when the Treasury general account dipped below $50 billion? When there is nothing left to borrow, we're then likely to see a return to quantitative easing. This means the Federal Reserve will start up printing press again, which could lead to inflation again. To summarize, there are two scenarios in which a high level of inflation, like we saw in 2022, could make a comeback. The first scenario is when debt levels, relative to the economy, become so big that the central bank is forced to increase money supply and inflate the debt away. This is what happened in the 1940s. The second scenario is when the US government cannot borrow money and have to drain liquidity out of the system, which means a return to quantitative easing. With all that said, it is not 100% sure that high level of inflation will necessarily return. For instance, Japan has an even higher level of government debt relative to its economy, but yet consumer prices have been flat for 3 decades and counting. But still, Japan has other factors, such as a shrinking population, at play. So, what do you think? If you like this video, please subscribe for more videos like this one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and I'll see you next time. Bye!